I'm going to, I never do anything I'm told to do, so I'm going to deviate just a second. Our Center for Local Prosperity, we have a board of 4 people, myself and 3 others. And I just want to take a minute to introduce the board. And Christine Sloan's one of our board members. I don't know where she's at. Christine Sloan and Betsy Allard and Bob Cervelli. Where's Bob at? And the reason I wanted to do this is I didn't have a lot. Matter of fact, I've never put together a conference before. A big learning curve. And one thing that Bob Cervelli taught me is when you put together a group of panelists, make sure that the panelists have a chance to get to know one another before they get to the panel. So what we've done over the last 4 or 5 months is have elaborate, long telephone conversations with all the specific panels. And it's been a marvelous learning experience to have all these panels get together on the phone and talk. Brilliant new ideas were coming about. So that was a marvelous, and I have to thank Bob Cervelli for teaching me how to do that. It was wonderful. And one of the discussions that we had was with Mark DeVilliers and Michael Schumann. And when we finished that conversation, I did not know Michael Schumann. I'd read Local Dollars and Local Cents, magnificent text. But it was his commitment to really helping a community deal with very specific problems. And what I learned about Michael Schumann, that he's been all over the world, and at one time has delivered a talk a week, 52 talks a year for 25 years. And but yet, when we talked on the phone, it's like we were the only people that mattered. And that made a real impression on me. Michael Schumann is a writer, an entrepreneur, an economist, but it's this last characteristic that I always have fun with. He's a lawyer. And so I got to thinking last night, I said, how many lawyers does it take to really enable a community to understand its own economics? And I think it only takes one, and it's Michael Schumann.
Well, now that I've been humiliated as being an economist, lawyer, and resident of Washington, D.C., can I have more strikes against me? It's a great pleasure to be here for many reasons. It's a great pleasure to be part of the ferment and the activities in Nova Scotia. And tomorrow morning I'm going to have the opportunity to say some other things that I'm not going to say tonight. But one of the themes of tomorrow is how many good things are going on here that you don't even appreciate, that are models for us in the United States. What I want to focus on, though, is something that is implicit in all of the points that Mark went through, and it was a great set of points that he visited, and it's the meaning of economic development. I want to talk about what the principles and practice of local economic development ought to look like. And in my view, one of the things that I was encouraged to read before I came here was this study called Now or Never, the Ivany Report. And I'm going to say a lot about this in a few minutes, but it did cause me to think that one thing about the report is absolutely right. You are at a crossroads. You are at a crossroads, and you have to choose the path for economic development ahead very carefully, because you can't have everything. It's not going to work. A starting place to think about economic development, in my view, is a story that I want to share that happened to me in Oregon about 10 years ago. in a county called Lane County. It's where Eugene, Oregon is. And one of the things that I like to do is I challenge economic developers to debates, public debates. And very few accept, but one person who did accept was the head of economic development for Lane County. And I was very fortunate that just before the debate, the local newspaper published an account of everything that this economic developer had been doing for 10 years. And like many American economic developers, for those 10 years, he had been handing out millions of dollars of tax abatements, tax forgiveness to companies that promised a certain number of jobs. And it turned out that 95% of those tax abatements went to 6 non-local companies. 3 came, took the benefits, and promptly shut down and moved to Asia. 2 came, took the benefits, and never delivered the jobs that they promised, and 1 was sort of on target. The other 5% of these millions of dollars went to 50 locally owned businesses. They all made very modest promises, and by and large, they delivered on their promises. The bottom line in terms of how much public money was required to create a job was stunning. Because in tax abatement terms, the cost of a local job was $2,000. The cost of the non-local job, all the jobs that had been generated by these 6 companies, was $22,000 per job. But remember, some of those jobs actually were no longer there at the end of that 10-year period. So in net job terms, the cost of a non-local job was $67,000. It was more than 30 times more expensive to get a job from the non-local business. Now, you may think that the $2,000 per job for a local job is a preposterous number, but I want to introduce you to my friend Lou Stein, sitting on the right there. Lou is from West Virginia. And for 6 years, he was generating several hundred jobs per year on a $150,000 budget at a cost of $500 per job. And he basically rolled up his sleeves and worked with entrepreneurs and gave them skills and helped them find monies. It wasn't very glorified work, but it works. Economic development at the micro level really works and is cost effective. Which brings me back to my friend Ray Ivany and the Ivany Report. If you read this report, there are many, many things there are many things to like about the report. I love the pictures. And there are, some of the prose isn't bad, but there's a lot of points that I think one can debate with, but I just want to focus on 3 of them. The first point in the Ivany Report is don't be biased about the businesses that you support for economic development. So here's a little quote from page 54. Business leaders and the wider community need to accept that not all businesses are equal in their economic impacts, and that just because an enterprise is small and locally owned does not mean that it is more deserving of government support than other firms that hold greater potential to generate wealth and employ more people over time. The possibility that local and small might actually generate more growth, we'll come back to growth in our discussion, is not even considered. The second point here is that we should prioritize exports. Exports are where the growth is going to happen. And here's from page 29. Being a small province and one with slow population growth means that Nova Scotia has a small domestic market. 1 million people is small. For most businesses to grow significantly, whether good producers or service providers, they have to have access to larger external markets through trade activities. So trade, export-led trade, is the only way you can grow your economy. This is a theme page after page after page. The last theme is one that I'm somewhat more sympathetic to, and it's basically saying we've got to build a coalition between people who want to expand the economy and people who want to protect natural resources. That one I'll say more about in a moment, but I think basically it's right. It's shallow, but it's right. Now, my criteria on how one builds a local economy is basically to go exactly the opposite direction of the Ivany report on the first 2 points. We need to maximize the percentage of jobs in locally owned businesses because they are superior contributors to economic development. And we need to maximize local self-reliance, not as a way of defecting from the global economy, but it's the only coherent way of participating in the global economy. And finally, we have to get past the milquetoast declarations that we need to mix environment and jobs and be more specific. We have to identify great triple bottom line businesses and spread them. So let me speak briefly to each of these. The first point that I want to make is that locally owned businesses are superior for economic development. This is a nice study that was done 2 years ago in British Columbia, looking at the impacts of consumer spending in 2 kinds of retailers and restaurants, one being chain-owned and one being independently owned. And you can see that in the independently owned restaurants on the left, for every Canadian dollar that is spent in those independent retailers and restaurants, 45 cents stays in the province of British Columbia. In the chain, it is about 18 cents. What this means in economic development terms, roughly speaking, is every time a British Columbian chooses to put money into an independent retailer or an independent restaurant rather than a chain, the province gets 2.5 times the jobs, 2.5 times the income and the wealth effects, 2.5 times the tax collections, 2.5 times the charitable contributions. And in fact, the study also showed that if British Columbians shifted their spending patterns by just 10%, the province would have 30,000 more jobs. Don't take my word for it, though. There have been 24 of these studies. Apparently, Mr. Ivany hasn't read any of them. And they show that for every dollar spent at a local business, you get between 2 and 4 times the economic development impacts. And not a single study has shown otherwise. Mr. Ivany also never saw this report from the Harvard Business Review that says more small firms means more jobs. It's a regression analysis of regions throughout the United States showing that those regions with the highest density of locally owned businesses have the highest job growth. Nor did Mr. Ivany read the Federal Reserve Atlanta from 2 years ago, which did another regression analysis and showed that per capita income growth was related to those regions with the highest density of locally owned businesses. In other words, if you want to get rid of poverty, if you want to get rid of inequality, the key is locally owned business. There are a bunch of other things that one gets with locally owned business. Resilience. You're less vulnerable if you're more self-reliant in something like energy to global catastrophes that are outside your control. Mark talked about smart growth. And if you think about it, if you want to create a walkable community, you basically need businesses that mix in with residential. and those businesses have to be small. A big box hellhole is not possibly a walkable community. It just doesn't spatially work. Tourism. Tourists are attracted by one-of-a-kind retailers and restaurants. Entrepreneurship. The report talks a lot, the Ivany report talks a lot about entrepreneurship, but doesn't point out that nearly all entrepreneurship is rooted in locally owned small businesses. That connection is never made. Public health. There is a growing literature that shows that communities with strong local businesses have strong local food economies, and those local food economies have lower incidences of type 2 diabetes and obesity. There's even a political science literature that says that in local business communities there are higher voter participation rates and higher degrees of volunteership. This list is so overwhelming. How could it escape the notice of the most important now or never study in Nova Scotia? Point 2. The key for prosperity is to maximize local self-reliance. Now, if you think about it, the strongest community, the strongest province, is going to be one that sells as much as it can locally and as much as it can globally. Local, global, that's the whole kit and caboodle, right? We want to maximize sales to the local market and maximize sales to the global market. Well, the mistake that the Ivany Commission makes is to say, we don't care about the local market. The only thing that's important is the global market. And they have causality exactly backwards. Because what we know is that globally competitive companies grow from small companies that initially start by selling things locally, and then they gradually move to other markets. Now, there is a big debate in economic development between different strategies of economic development, export-led versus import replacing. And the argument that economic developers make is, if we just sell things to one another in the province of Nova Scotia, we're just circulating existing money and no one's getting any wealthier. The only way we really can generate new wealth is by selling things to other people outside the province. This is absolutely incorrect from an economic standpoint, and I'll show you why. The export-led argument says we're going to do a non-local sale, and that brings one new dollar into the community. Now, if I have a sale locally, what people forget is that every dollar that I spend locally with a local business is a dollar I don't have to import from the outside. So if I have a dollar of import substituting business, I expand a local food business and need to import a little less food, well, now the community has another dollar. So what's the difference between a dollar gained from export-led development and a dollar gained from import substitution? Nothing. There is no difference whatsoever. Now, there is a big difference in terms of how businesses naturally develop. And that's why I want to give you this example from Ann Arbor, Michigan, of the little delicatessen that could, called Zingerman's. Zingerman's started out as a pretty successful deli for its first 10 years in the 1980s. They needed to grow in order to give more job opportunities to their middle management. They thought they would lose them. So they decided, well, they puzzled over whether or not they would become a chain like Schlotzsky's. And they decided against it for two reasons. One, they cared about quality control, and they were afraid that, if they just kept growing, they would lose it. Paul Saginaw, one of the founders of Zingerman, said, "The last thing I want to do in my declining years is fly around the country and see second-rate versions of myself." The other reason was the relationships. They loved to come to Ann Arbor and come to work and, kibitz, forgive my Yiddish, kibitz with all of their friends. So they decided, rather than growing out, they would grow deep. So they looked at things coming into the deli and basically saw new business opportunities. So, for example, we serve bread on sandwiches. We could create a bakehouse. We serve coffee. We could create a coffee roasting company. We serve ice cream and cheese. We could create a creamery. Then they looked at things coming out of the deli, and they saw other business opportunities. We have great food. We could create a sit-down restaurant called the Roadhouse. We have great cakes. We could create a mail-order cake business. We have great customer service. We could create a business training apparatus called ZingTrain. So in all, Zingerman's is now 10 independently owned businesses. They all have independent partnerships, but they co-license the brand. They meet once a week for quality control. And collectively, they hire 650 people in Ann Arbor and have sales of over $50 million a year. Now, conventional economic development, following advice like the Ivany report, would have said that Zingerman's was impossible, because Zingerman's should have focused, Ann Arbor should have focused on its trade opportunities, not on its import substitution opportunities. We should look at the strengths of Ann Arbor, like University of Michigan has a great med school, not the weaknesses. There was bupkis going on in food. But they created a sector, a cluster from scratch. And that is the ticket for rural communities everywhere to prosperity, is to create business clusters from scratch around local demand, knowing, like Zingerman's knew, that once you saturate local demand, you naturally start to sell things outside of Michigan. Last point. I agree with the Ivany Commission that, we need to balance the environment with growth. But here's the thing. We have to let people know what are the businesses that really succeed. By show of hands here, how many people here know of at least one business with good profits that treats its workforce well and has good environmental performance? Yeah, we all know someone. We need to teach the people who write these studies that this exists. As Kenneth Boulding says, anything that exists is possible. And if it's possible, we need to spread these ideas of environmental business design. Now, the one other thing that one sees and hears again and again in this study is that the scale of small and local is incapable of growth. Note again, from that standpoint, Zingerman's never would have happened. I want to give you two pieces of evidence that underscore that local businesses are extremely competitive. This graph here is of the economy of the United States. And what it shows is between 1998 and 2008, how does the structure of our economy depend on size? So the top stripe, the black stripe, is the percentage of jobs in home-based businesses. It has expanded slightly. The next stripe is businesses with under 100 employees, which all of us call small. The next band, the blue band, is 100 to 500 employees. In the United States, we still call these small businesses. And the red stripe is 500 plus employees. Now, the first three stripes on top, I can tell you 99.9% of those firms are locally owned. The only non-local stuff is in the bottom. If it were true that local businesses were becoming less competitive,
we would have seen jobs move from out of those top sectors and into this sector.
and yet there's been no change. And there's been no change despite the best efforts of economic developers to kill local business, because they've been systematically subsidizing the attraction and retention of non-local businesses, not understanding that this harms local businesses. And yet, local businesses have been remarkably resilient. The same thing is true in Canada. Despite your best efforts to kill local businesses, they have remained so this is a slightly different measure. It's smaller businesses, under 100 employees, and yet their percentage of GDP for the last decade has remained pretty steady. What about profit rates? Well, in the United States, it turns out that the profit rates of sole proprietorships, which most small businesses either are or start out as, are 11 times greater than those of C corporations. Now, there's some funny things about the way the U.S. measures this, so I turn to the Canadians for better data. Your most recent data show that the highest profit rates are 10 to 20 employees. The lowest profit rates are those firms that you are trading on the Toronto Stock Exchange. So let's pause for a second. You folks here are all locavores. I've just pointed out to you that the majority of our economies are locally owned small businesses. I've pointed out to you that they're remarkably competitive and they're remarkably profitable. So let's look at everyone's behavior here. By show of hands, how many people have mindfully bought something locally over the last week? Yeah, you wouldn't be here otherwise. How many people here do their banking at a local bank or credit union? Okay, those of you who didn't raise hands, by tomorrow you're going to be cowering in tears in the corner. But leave that alone for now. Those of you with pension funds, how many of you put at least 1% of your pension funds in locally owned small business? So I see a dribbling of hands. 1%. Okay, this is outrageous. Here you are in a conference that's all about local resilience and all about supporting your economy, and you folks, the best locavores in Nova Scotia, are systematically over-investing in firms on the Toronto Stock Exchange and under-investing, most of you not investing anything, in local small business. This is a big problem, and the problem is you. Now, there are things that we can do about this, and in my view, there are 6 Ps that one needs to follow. Make it easy, put it all in one letter. Planning, people, partners, purchasing, and policy making. Planning means study all the leaks in your economy, all the places where people are unnecessarily buying outside goods and services, and then make businesses aware that these are opportunities for import substitution. People, train a new generation of entrepreneurs to lead these import substituting businesses. Partners, let's create teams of local businesses that are more competitive than if they just operate independently. For example, in Tucson, Arizona, there's a group called Tucson Originals, group of local restaurants that collectively buy foodstuffs and bring down their unit costs. Purse, how do we solve this problem of putting our savings to work in local business? Purchasing, how do we spearhead buy local or local first campaigns? And policy making, how do we spearhead government initiatives that do all of these things, that support all of these things? So To what extent did the Ivany report comment or make recommendations around each of these things? I thought, since I'm a professor at Simon Fraser and I have to grade students every now and then, I would grade Ray Ivany. Planning. Planning. There is no leakage analysis in this report whatsoever. No understanding of the potential of local demand. But I didn't give them an F, because in a small little paragraph, this report says local food is a good thing and local energy is a good thing. But why local food and local energy are good things but local everything else is not makes no sense. D, people. That's the good thing in this report. It says lots of great things about entrepreneurship. Unfortunately, all the examples they give are at least 25 years old. So they don't talk about the cutting edge of entrepreneurship programs, which we're going to talk about tomorrow. Partnerships. Some vague language about how businesses can work together, but I, as a business, would get no guidance from this report. A gentleman's C on that one. Purse. F. There is not a word in this report about people localizing capital. There's a reflection on the history of Nova Scotia that 100 years ago, people in this province were able to put their money together and put it to use to the development of industry. But alas, today in global capital, all the banks are now national and all of the securities are national. No recommendations on how to fix this problem. There is not a word, and this is incredibly embarrassing, not a word about local purchasing in this report. And finally, on policy making, well, let me give you a feel for what the policy section is like. It says, government's economic development programming investments are constantly pulled in different directions to support new startups, to help existing enterprises to expand, to assist firms that need to restructure. Significant government investment also goes to relatively strong and financially healthy companies, simply as incentives for them to locate or expand in Nova Scotia rather than somewhere else. While all these kinds of investments of public money can be controversial at times, in most cases there are sound business arguments for them. What? What? Okay. You folks in Nova Scotia do not have unlimited money in public policy. That is a theme in this report. You do not have unlimited dollars. And every hour of somebody's time in economic development spent on attraction or retention of a non-local business, every dollar spent in support of one of these global behemoths is an hour and a dollar that cannot be put into the local businesses that we know are essential for economic development. Here's where I want to leave you. With Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. You may recall, this is the third Indiana Jones movie, that after Indiana suffered through snakes and spiders and terrorists, he comes to a crypt. And there's this 500-year-old guardian who says, Indiana, your final task will be to choose among these 50 goblets. Choose the goblet from which Christ drank, and choose wisely. Well, at that point, this guy, the German spy, jumps to the front and says, I know which one Christ would have drunk from. It would have been the most ornate. He drinks from it and he spontaneously combusts. And the guardian says, he chose poorly. Folks, Ray Ivany will have you choose poorly. It is time for you to choose a path that's rooted in what we know works. Local businesses, self-reliance, triple bottom line businesses following the 6 Ps. Tomorrow, I will share with you a bunch of cutting-edge ways that those 6 Ps operate, but hopefully this lays a little bit of a foundation about how we can proceed differently. Thank you.
Well, I don't know what to say. So I'm not going to say anything. So what I would like to do now is, in the center of a room, we have a microphone, and we've got at least 15 to 20, maybe 30 minutes that we would like to have people ask questions to these 2 keynotes. So don't be shy, take your time.
And if Ray Ivany is here, we can have a little chat afterwards.
And if you just be so kind as to give your name so we know who we're talking with.
Hi, my name is Richard Bell. I actually know Michael from a different political context, but my question is about the politics of something like the Ivany Report. There are many of these reports turning around. There was a fisheries one, there are forests, this is what government tends to do when people are upset about something. A huge amount of money was spent on this report. Lots of people were involved in various ways. Could you comment, are you aware of examples in other places where a similar effort yielded a more rational final product?
So I would like to turn to a conservative intellectual, F.A. Hayek, because I think he has something to say about all of this. And Hayek basically argues that information is very particular to a place. And when you start to generalize information at larger than a local place, when you start to go to regional scales or provincial scales or national scales, fundamental facts get lost. And I think that's the problem with reports like this, is that the effort to please so many different interests leads to a kind of bureaucratic language that still has an underlying language, linguistics that are fundamentally odious, and yet, it sounds very reasonable and sounds very compromising, and every sentence is on the one hand or on the other. That was one of the things I loved about Herman Daly, who lost his arm in the war, and he says, I'm the only economist who doesn't say, on the one hand, on the other. Anyway, but I just feel like these reports have to be local. They have to be consistent with local character and not mucked up with these larger scale bureaucratic templates. What would you say?
It depends is Nova Scotia local or not. In the global economy, you could argue that Nova Scotia is in fact local, and there is a coherence to the society that could make a generalized report sensible. I happen to agree with you, this isn't it. But I think it's doable. Local doesn't necessarily mean, the 10-mile radius of where we are. It could be a little greater than that. Depends how coherent the society is and how coherent and how uniform the problems are. And I think you can argue that I think Nova Scotia at least could be divided into no more than 2 or 3 coherent entities for that purpose.
Hi, Hi, I'm Karen Foster. I'm wondering what both speakers think about an idea that comes up in discussions of both steady state economics and relocalizing economic development, and that is the reduction of work time.
Well, you know, if you read people like Bill McKibben and so on, he's arguing for the deliberate, not destabilizing, but to build in deliberate inefficiencies into the economy so as to use up fewer resources. I've never quite understood this scheme on his part, but one of the arguments that he will put forward is that one of the consequences of doing this would be to reduce the number of hours that would be necessary to work to produce the reduced amount of finished goods that the society would consequently need. I've never quite understood the reasoning behind this this argument, so I'm not sure I really accept that proposition at all. Michael, do you think?
Well, I think all of us want the freedom to sort of choose how we structure our lives and to have the ability to choose a life where you are, working less may be attractive to some people, and it would be great to figure out structures that facilitate that. Frankly, I write stories about entrepreneurs, and what I'm struck by is how many people quit job A to become an entrepreneur, to have more control over their life, but it certainly didn't lead to less work. It just led to more satisfying work. And maybe that ought to be the more important goal. I mean, I think it's, the old vision of like leisure was good and work was bad, I think that was based in an industrial workforce where people didn't enjoy their jobs very much. I love my work. I want to do more of it. I mean, work is leisure. Leisure is work. I'm just confused by these concepts, and I'm lucky in that respect because I know a lot of people don't have that luxury. But I think it's very important that we try to improve the quality of work rather than reduce the time.
And just for people's information, I don't have the schedule in front of me, but Anders Hayden from Dalhousie University is, I think that's Saturday. Is that right, Bob? There's a panel that Anders Hayden is on with Susan Witt and some other people and some speakers that are going to be quite specific on that particular question.
Hi, Andrew Wetmore. The first political campaign I was on was here in Nova Scotia over 40 years ago, and the party with which I campaigned was made a big effort to argue for the stay option, the option so that a worker could have a satisfactory job in this place. And if we think it's bad now of people going off to Alberta to get their work, or not anymore, but it was the same issue then, and it was the same issue 150 years before that. And at that time, and I think now, that proposal that there should be a bias in favor of a stay option was ridiculed as being immature or unrealistic. Unrealistic, I guess, if the only important thing is making the most amount of money by whatever means for somebody. But what needs to happen for that sort of attitude to have serious consideration, and not only in general conversation, but in matters of policy?
I really don't have a response to that. Sorry, I'm not sure.
Well, what I would say is that a community made up of locally owned businesses is a fairly stable community. And one of the dangers and Mark mentioned this, the danger of building your future around a non-local business is that some decision maker far away using criteria that have no relationship to your community's well-being may make the decision to like get up and move elsewhere and throw a bunch of people out of work. So it's always seemed to me that if you want a stable community economy, that's another reason why you want the highest percentage of people employed in locally owned business, because those businesses are making decisions that are fundamentally influenced by the people living in those communities. It's not perfect. There still is transition and upheaval in a locally owned economy. It's just less wrenching and less severe and less happens all at the same time than with an economy made up of a small number of large outside-owned companies.
One of the interesting examples is, in fact, in that Bowater newsprint mill that I mentioned. It closed in Brooklyn. That was owned by a multinational conglomerate. It was actually 40% owned by the Washington Post, as it happened, but their 60% was owned by a multinational. And when it closed, as I said, 300 direct jobs and many indirect jobs were to be eliminated. But in the following 2 years, there has been an interesting set of developments, three separate strains of development in a sense. One of them was one thing that Nova Scotia has become familiar with and is now being eliminated because of the low price of oil. A lot of the Bowater people simply went to Alberta, kept their families at home, and commuted from Alberta to Nova Scotia. That was some of them. There was an attempt on the provincial government's part to kind of prime the pump and push businesses into the community from outside. They did some of those things correctly. They pushed small kind of developmental startups rather than pushing big multinationals or big corporations. So there was an innovation center set up, which we all thought was going to be a waste of resources. But it turns out that half a dozen small companies have started up in this space and are employing 5, 6, 7, 8 people each, and working with academic communities such as Dalhousie's and Acadia's to grow those independently. But so there's been an interesting switch in the kind of psychology of the town. Now that some of the people are coming back from Alberta, which isn't working out quite as well as they'd hoped, there's a new kind of confidence appearing in the town because there's a realization that we can actually do it ourselves without any outside intervention. Whereas before, people were dropping out of school because you could go and work at the mill, and your father worked there and he retired and got a nice pension, and you could go and work there. Right? And that abruptly disappeared, but the consequences have been enormously positive, and we have had the startups. I would say I can think of 6 or 7 small businesses that have started out of people who simply lost their jobs when the mill closed. So the feeling in the town is actually quite positive.
Hello, my name is Amy Buckland-Nix, and I'm just curious, what do you think are the top maybe major obstacles do you see for building local resilient economies? And particularly I'm interested in how the free trade agreements impact freedoms with building local economies.
Two important and somewhat different questions. So my own bias in the field is that the single biggest obstacle is capital. It's the issue that we demonstrated here when everyone said that you were investing in non-local securities, even though we know local securities are key for community well-being. That's what we've got to fix. And the reason for this is that both Canada and the United States, and frankly most of the industrialized world, has securities laws that were enacted in the early Jurassic period. And these securities laws need to be radically overhauled. There are some things that you've done in your securities laws, like your CDIFs that were enacted in 1998, community economic development, financial institutions, or investment funds, I'm sorry, I mixed that up there. And those are great. And we have nothing like that in the United States, and it allows the, grassroots investors to come together and make funds where they invest their pension funds. And Linda Best will tell you about her fund, Farms Works, that does this tomorrow. In another area of securities law, the issuance of securities, we in the United States have been radically reforming our national and state laws to make it easier for local businesses to allow the 99% of us who are non-wealthy, so-called unaccredited investors, to invest in these companies. And you in Canada have been much slower in all this. And the reforms that you've done in Nova Scotia thus far, I think, are pretty boring and not going to be enough. So that's for me the top agenda, is bringing securities laws up to date and allowing all of us to invest in the things we want to invest in. Second thing that's I think important with respect to the free trade agreement is, there are certain public policies that restrict our choices as communities. I consider myself more free trade than most of the economists out there who call themselves free traders. The problem is that the free trade agreements that are being negotiated now are not about free trade. They're about destruction of local authority to have reasonable governance in the name of corporate power. And our entire discussion about free trade mutated about 20 years ago, from trade into corporate power, and we've got to pull out of it. So I do think that we have to be mindful of these trade agreements. But here's one thing to take heart in, that these trade agreements, by and large, while they give tremendous advantages to multinational corporations, and they hurt the freedoms of local government, you still have a lot of freedom running your own local business or a co-op or a nonprofit or a social enterprise to do what you want despite those agreements. So there still is a space that we can call our own and be very creative in.
But that space seems to be diminishing, and that the new trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and so on are going to tighten those restrictions even further. As far as we know, because the text has not been released, it's only been leaked in portions, so we're not quite sure exactly what's going to happen. But Michael's right, these are not really about trade. These agreements really aren't increasing trade, they're simply increasing the free flow of capital, and there is quite considerable leeway, as Michael just pointed out, short of that for operating in a local business without violating any of those agreements.
I think we've got time for just one, maybe two more questions. We stacked up there.
Yeah, hi, good evening. Phil Ferrero. My wife and I run a NGO called the Institute for Bioregional Studies. So, Michael, I've read your book, and I've been a proponent and advocate of local economies and regional economics for most of my adult life. I have a comment, a very brief comment, and then a question, okay? The Ivany report, I think you're a little, maybe unduly harsh. And to the extent that I don't think it was a paper written and produced to provide solutions, okay? I know living in Prince Edward Island, I used to live in the valley here and had a small organic farm, but I'm in Prince Edward Island now. And I can tell you the impact that that report has had in PEI is that it was a wake-up call for how bad things are. It wasn't a paper written about solutions. And the impact that it's had on PEI is that it has spurned meetings right across the island about people getting together and say, look, we don't need an Ivany report. The same situation that occurs in Nova Scotia is here, and we need to start developing local solutions. So it's had a very positive impact, although I agree with you that it's short on solutions. But I don't think that was the intent of the paper. My question is I'm wondering how you would reply to some of the comments of Mr. de Villiers, which sounded a little too libertarian for my taste. First off, I would, if I had the time, I would debate you all night long and part of tomorrow on your comment on GMOs. But you should realize that even Monsanto has gotten out of the GMO development. But the comment that really concerned me was that there's too much regulation in business, and that any business should be allowed to create whatever it wants, any way it wants, and that let the consumer decide whether or not they want to buy it. Is that part of your local economic vision?
I'm not sure I said that any business should be able to create anything it wants in any way it wants. Obviously, there are environmental laws, there are health laws,
Exactly.
a number of other things that would put constraints around that. What I'm suggesting is that we're living in a community that's, in my view, grotesquely overregulated, and I think we need to back off some and allow people to express their visions without being bound up in bundles of regulatory restrictions. And I think there's obviously you can't just allow people to do whatever they want because, but there are already laws to do that. There are health laws, there are consumer protection laws, there are all kinds of laws. And I think we need to, it's just the regulations about the zoning, about where you can do what. You're not allowed to, there are many zoning regulations that say you can't run a business out of your house. I think this is retrogressive, and I think we should back off considerably from that. We'll talk about GMOs tomorrow. I have a whole argument about that, which I'm happy to share with you.
So I'll just respond to the first part of what you said. And look, I had 20 minutes to present. I wanted to leave an impression. I didn't want to speak in the same bureaucratic language of the report. So it's true that I probably did overstate my case. Although that said, I'd welcome a face-to-face debate with Mr. Ivany at any time and place of his choosing. The one point that you made, though, that I would disagree with is that my indictment of the report is not the absence of solutions. In fact, it has a bunch of solutions. They just are all wrong. And it's also that its diagnosis is wrong. Its diagnosis of what contributes to economic growth. Again, we can debate about economic growth, but what contributes to growth of jobs and growth of income is wrong. And so if that's wrong, I don't know what groups are meeting about. What are you trying to fix if the analysis is wrong?
I'm Len Barron. I've lived in the same town for a long time, and almost all the money I spend locally, and every place I go, I get treated beautifully. And being treated nicely is a very nice way to live. And so I don't think we give enough attention to how we're being treated. And we deserve to be treated nicely because it feels good and it's also healthy. So.
And we'll take this one last question.
Hi, my name is Michelle Kulik, and I'm wearing a couple hats tonight, but the question, which I'm not really altogether sure is a question, comes out of my former position as an instructor. I taught in fashion, so I come from the garment industry, manufacturing. I've been in manufacturing in Canada since the 80s. Recently, I taught a class in global sourcing, and we talked about the low labor paradox. I'm turning really red here. I'm not sure if it's the wine at dinner or whatever, but anyway. So I contacted who I thought was the former Prime Minister, Brian D. Mulroney, one night after a few glasses of wine by email, and he responded. I got a labor lawyer out of Montreal, and basically I was asking him about how he felt about the loosening of our tariffs and quotas in the garment industry and in manufacturing as a result of free trade. I do find it very curious that we gather and we talk about revitalizing local economies and local manufacturing, and we seem to avoid that elephant in the room. We all express surprise and dismay when we discover that Joe Fresh is bringing in our clothing that we all purchase at Superstore from Bangladesh. We have no one but ourselves to blame for this because we have allowed these agreements to be signed. I've sat in a room with Department of Labor ministers, and they've looked at me like I have three heads when I say, why can't we change these trade agreements? Why can't we protect our industries? And I think this is important conversations we need to be having if we're looking at revitalizing local economies and local manufacturing. If we want to give a competitive edge to the people who are making socks, to Patricia who wants to be growing linen and making linen clothing for us. Every single one of us in this room is wearing clothing. We all wear socks. Do we know where our socks come from? We question why our food is not grown locally. That's because it's cheaper at this point because of reduced tariffs and duties to get food from offshore. So I think we need to look at those things. We need to ask our politicians, and we need to push them that that these things, they say they're written in stone, but I think we're showing here by our voices that we don't believe these things are written in stone. And so I don't know if that was a question, but maybe it's something we can consider tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Well, it's been a pleasure, and I thank you for being here this evening. Tomorrow morning we start here again at 9 o'clock with a series of talks, some breakout sessions, some topic tables. It's going to be a long, interesting day, and so let's call it a night, and I will see you here tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.